the late 1930s, while established, Lockheed were not yet a major player within the industry. Only in 1932 had the company been declared bankrupt before being bought out. Following this, they did have some success producing a few larger single and twin-engine aircraft. They were keen to break into the four-engine airline market, and in 1937 they began designing a larger four-engine airliner known as the Model 44 Excalibur. While there was some interest in the design, this model never went past the design phase. In 1938, Howard Hughes purchased a majority stake in Transcontinental Western Air, TWA, and he wanted a new fleet of four-engine pressurized aircraft to put the airline above the competition. At the time, TWA finances were not in great shape, and thus Hughes believed these new airliners could help turn the company around. In a phone call that lasted well over 8 hours, Hughes had discussed the idea of such an aircraft with TWA chief Jack Fry, and by the end of it, they had a basic outline of what they wanted. The specification called for an aircraft capable of carrying 20 passengers and 6,000 pounds of cargo, with intentions of using it to open the first coast-to-coast non-stop service in the United States. Both Lockheed and Consolidated were approached, however Consolidated showed little interest in the design. Additionally, Hughes, realizing the benefits of the new aircraft, also required that the project was to be undertaken in complete secrecy to ensure that competitor airlines would not get ahead of them. He also requested that no other airline could get the design until TWA had 35 of them. This was believed to give TWA 2 years of exclusive use of the new aircraft, putting them miles ahead of their competitors and generating many new customers. Design work was led by Lockheed's chief research engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, with Lockheed offering Hughes the L-049 Constellation. This was no adaptation of the Excalibur design, instead being a fresh and new aircraft. The Constellation offered a pressurized cabin, capacity for 44 passengers, a top speed of 350 miles per hour, and became the first aircraft to include hydraulically boosted power controls. The tail unit contained a distinct three-tail arrangement, this done to keep the height of the aircraft down so it could fit into pre-existing hangars while providing extra yaw stability. Power was to come from 4 Wright R3350-35 duplex Cyclone radial engines, each providing some 2,200 horsepower each. There was some debate early on over whether to install the Wright R2600 instead of the R3350, but ultimately the greater potential of the duplex Cyclone won. The pressurized cockpit was particularly important as it allowed for the Constellation to fly higher than other airliners and thus avoid about 90% of all weather disturbances, making flights safer and smoother for passengers. It would become the first airliner to fly above 12,500 feet, usually flying about 20,000 feet. Lockheed priced the new model at $425,000 USD per model, to which reportedly Hughes commented along the lines of, "TWA can't afford and can't pay for these aircraft, but I can and will build 40. And thus, even though TWA was not in a position to finance the machines themselves, Hughes placed and bought 40 of the new Constellations for them. Another important reason for getting Hughes and his company to buy the aircraft was that it kept TWA's name off any of the paperwork, allowing the purchasing of these aircraft to remain secret. The Constellation program would remain under wraps until well into 1941, when it was eventually publicly announced. This did cause a stir among other airlines. American Airlines, unhappy about not being told, would refuse to buy any more planes from Lockheed. Pan American Airways were also not overly happy, however they decided to try and join the program. Hughes was extremely reluctant about this, however eventually came around to it, on the condition that Pan Am could only use their Constellations for international routes and were uncompetitive with TWA. Consequently, Pan Am became the second airline to order the Constellation when they placed orders for 20 L-049s and another 10 of the long-range version. The vision was to use these on Pan Am routes into Latin America. With the United States entry into the war at the end of 1941, production and orders were quickly taken over by the military, and the Constellation received the designation of C-69. The C-69 would be utilized for transporting troops, featuring 44 seats on the right-hand side of the fuselage and 4 folding 4-seat benches on the left-hand side. This allowed the C-69 to carry about 60 passengers. At the back of the aircraft, 2 lavatories could be found, and other military extras included updated avionics for military purposes and the inclusion of the Identification Friend or Foe IFF transponder. Drawings were also developed for C-69As and C-69B variants, these being military-specific developments. The C-69A being a 100 troop transporter and the C-69B having a greater range. However, none of these 2 variants were ever proceeded with. On the 9th of January 1943, the Constellation took to the skies for the first time with Lockheed test pilot Milo Burkham and Boeing test pilot Eddie Allen at the controls. It is said that the first flight was quite the success, and as a result, 5 more flights occurred throughout the rest of the day. The official report from the first flight put it in quite simple and dull terms. Quote, "Everything functioned without incident and with normal characteristics." End quote. There would be very few changes needed on production aircraft, something that was quite the rarity, but showed the soundness of the Constellation design. In April 1944, Hughes set out to highlight the impressive design the Constellation was by attempting to break the transcontinental speed record. The flight would be between Burbank and Washington, D.C., with Hughes and TWA Chief Jack Fry at the controls. The record was smashed, with the Constellation flying non-stop to Washington, D.C. in a time of 6 hours, 57 minutes and 51 seconds, averaging a speed of 331 miles per hour. Furthermore, Hughes is said to have blindsided the US military top brass who were expecting the Constellation to arrive wearing a drab olive military paint job. However, Hughes, wanting to capitalize on the publicity of such a flight, ensured that the TWA logo was plastered on the front of the aircraft. Following the record-breaking flight, this specific Constellation was returned to the military to undertake further testing, where Orville Wright, acting as co-pilot on one of the tests, undertook his last flight. The United States Army Air Force had placed orders for 22 C-69s that included 9 originally ordered by TWA, 30 C-69As and 210 C-69Bs. However, teething problems, delays with the engines, military bureaucracy, and the prioritization of Lockheed to build P-38 Lightnings meant that the Constellation never entered full service during the war, with only 15 being delivered by the time hostilities ended. The United States Army Air Force primarily relied on the C-54, the military version of the DC-4, for the role that the Constellation was going to fulfill. With the war ending, the military cancelled production of the Constellation. TWA wanted its baby back and thus bought as many as they could back from the US government. The original prototype was also bought back, with Lockheed using it to test the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine as a possible power plant for the Constellation. This was due to initial problems with the duplex Cyclone engines, although these were quickly rectified. The Constellation would be offered for sale with 3 different engine options: the duplex Cyclone, the double wasp, and the Bristol Centaurus engines. However, orders only came in for the duplex Cyclone version. The C-69s bought back from the military were converted into airliners ready for civil use by Lockheed. Designated Model L049, modifications included the fitment of a galley, and the navigator's compartment was converted into a crew rest area for long-haul flights. Finally, in February 1946, Constellations began commercial services with TWA. While TWA had hoped for exclusive use of the aircraft pre-war, the war had meant that TWA had lost much of this advantage. This can be highlighted in the fact that it was Pan Am who operated the first commercial service with the Constellation on the 3rd of February 1946, beating TWA by some 3 days. The Constellation would boast being one of the only aircraft on the market that was pressurized, putting it ahead of its competitors as it could fly into the higher altitudes, making it a smoother journey for all. However, the early career of the Constellation was not all positive. The issues existed with engine fires and propeller failures. Furthermore, on the 11th of July 1946, a Constellation undertaking training flight out of Reading, Pennsylvania, crashed, resulting in 5 of the 6 crew members being killed. As a result, all Constellations were grounded for 6 weeks. But the Constellation was still extremely popular and proving a big success. TWA opened up a route from New York to Paris, and airlines around the world were placing orders. Furthermore, Pan Am opened the first around-the-world service in June of 1947 with the Constellation. The L049s were upgraded numerous times to increase maximum takeoff weight, and in all, 88 C-69s L049s were built, 82 of which were utilized as airliners. TWA and Pan Am were the biggest users of this variant. Work continued to improve on the Model 049, and in October 1946, a revised version, the Model 649, was unveiled. Known as the Golden Plate Connie, it had upgraded Wright R3350BD1 duplex cyclones that could produce some 2,500 horsepower each, new reversible pitch props helping to shorten landing rolls, and passenger comfort was considerably upgraded with updated climate controls and a significant reduction in noise levels. Another optional feature added a little later and utilized on all future variants was a SpeedPack cargo store that can be installed underneath the fuselage of the aircraft. It had the ability to add an additional 8,300 pounds of cargo while only reducing top speed by 19 km per hour and having no noticeable effect on the handling of the machine. However, only 14 of the 649s were delivered and only to Eastern Airlines. TWA were going to buy them but faced internal issues, and many airlines who had it on order upgraded their order to the newer Model 749. The Model 749's main difference to that of the Model 649 was the additional fuel tanks in the outer wings, boosting the Constellation's range by some 1,600 kilometers. The Model 749 would be utilized by airlines such as KLM, TWA, Air France, Air India, and Qantas, plus a handful more, with 60 examples of this version being built. The Model 749 was then followed by the Model 749A, with only minor differences in the utilization of Curtiss paddle blade propellers and structural reinforcements, allowing a higher maximum takeoff weight. Another 59 was sold to airlines, with many earlier versions of the Constellation being updated to the new configuration. While the Model 749 was quite successful as an airliner, it also caught the attention of the U.S. Air Force, who wanted it for use as both a cargo and VIP transport. Hence, in February 1948, orders were placed for 10 examples, receiving the new designation of C-121A and VC-121B. The first of the 10 to be delivered was the one and only VC-121B VIP transport, which arrived in November 1948. It could carry 24 passengers during the day and at night had room for 10 sleepers and 4 seated passengers, and was utilized as a transport for the Secretary of the Air Force and the Secretary of Defense. The remaining 9 machines were built as C-121As, which were redesigned as transporters with modifications to include a cargo loading door on the port side of the fuselage and a reinforced floor. These C-121As would be quite heavily involved in the Berlin airlift during 1948-49. After being used as transporters, these C-121As were converted to VC-121As and utilized as VIP transports, with some receiving upgrades to become VC-121Bs. The VC-121s were utilized by many high-ranking officials, including General Eisenhower before and then early on in his stint as US President, and General MacArthur during the Korean War. Eisenhower's VC-121 was known as Columbine II, and would become the first aircraft in history to receive the call sign Air Force One. This was after an incident in May 1954 when carrying Eisenhower and a call sign of Air Force Flight 8610, confusion arose when they checked in with ATC at the same time Eastern Airlines Flight 8610 checked in. As a result, a decision was made to designate the plane carrying the President Air Force One, and hence the Columbine II was the first to use the call sign. However, during the 1960s, as newer transports were brought in, once again the VC-121s were converted back to hauling cargo. By August 1968, the final C-121 was retired. The US Navy also showed interest in using the Constellation. Receiving the designation PO-1W, 2 examples began trials in being used as a radar platform for airborne early warning. These constellations contain radars both underneath the aircraft in a ballyred dome and then another set in a dome above the aircraft, and an array of antennas totaling some 140. In 1952, the designation was changed to WV-1. The Navy was satisfied with the aircraft and ultimately would put orders in for a Navy version of the Super Constellation, but more on that in the next video. The Constellation would prove to be a very popular airliner and one that flew all over the globe and for a great variety of different companies. It proved to be more efficient and more comfortable than early jet airliners that were beginning to appear. It was not uncommon following use as an airliner for them to be converted for use as a cargo aircraft, and some were on occasion even converted to be crop sprayers. Another ex-Air France machine ended up being utilised as the VIP transport for then Senegal President Léopold Senghor throughout the 1960s. The Constellation was quite revolutionary for its time, pushing commercial aviation forward with class and elegance. Development work didn't stop either, with Lockheed introducing the Super Constellation in 1951. But that is a story for another video. Today there are around 15 constellations left in the world, not including super constellations. These are spread throughout the world, and at least 2 of them, both VC-121As, are in airworthy condition. One of the airworthy examples is the original Air Force One, the Columbine 2. The Constellation, with its sleek and graceful lines, was quite the significant airliner. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure to go leave a like and subscribe for future videos. In the meantime, keep flying high.